History teaches us one thing. Change is inevitable. This most ancient truth has been illustrated time and time again as every great empire, no matter how powerful, eventually falls. In every instance, wise men have predicted their empire's end, but their dire warnings went unheeded. Is it possible that in modern times this may be happening close to home? Could America be headed for catastrophe? There are men among us today who believe a collapse is not only possible, but that it has already begun. Unlike Nostradamus or other bygone prophets, they look not to crystal balls or the stars, but to actual evidence to reinforce their claims. Their visions are of financial instability, oil and water depletion, hostile technology, and terrorist aggression. These men are gathering now to share their visions of the dangers that threaten the American way of life. They look to the lessons of empires past for clues to how we may avoid their fate, for ways we can prevent history from repeating itself so that America does not descend into oblivion, like every great empire that has come before. Michael Craig Rupert has long foreseen the impending threats to America. Born in 1951 in Washington, D.C., his family had ties to the CIA, U.S. Air Force, and Army. As a detective for the Los Angeles Police Department, he uncovered a CIA drug trafficking operation in 1977. This led him to found an organization dedicated to exposing government corruption. A political renegade, he has never been afraid to speak his mind, and Rupert is now certain our society is disintegrating from within.
We cannot, as a nation, as a planet, or as a species, continue to live the way we have under the assumptions that we have, because if we do, we are committing suicide.
This isn't about environmentalism anymore. This is not a lefty, feel-good, fuzzy, warm, save the whale issue. This is a matter of survival.
By this time next year, I'm certain that we won't recognize the United States of America.
Rupert believes that our explosive population growth over the past 2 centuries is the result of one thing: fossil fuel.
One of the first applications was to create an internal combustion-powered tractor for the purpose of plowing, because you could multiply the number of acres that could be plowed. And then it was discovered that you could make fertilizers out of ammonia, which is produced from natural gas. So it became possible to feed many more people as oil and natural gas began to be used more and more. It is solely the fact of hydrocarbon energy, specifically internal combustion-powered engines, ammonium-based fertilizers made from natural gas, and pesticides made from petroleum, that has allowed the human population to expand in just a little over 120, 130 years. In the starkest terms, human population was fairly stable at just under 1.5, 2 billion people from the time of Christ until oil was discovered. There was a slight dip for the bubonic plague, a slight increase as the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution came along with steam and with coal. But it was not until the discovery and use of oil that human population skyrocketed from a simple arithmetic standpoint. If you just look at the numbers, essentially 5 billion too many people are living on this planet today that are not sustainable by any other means. As human civilization undergoes this enormous, painful transition, everything that mankind has held sacred is on the table. It's a matter of life and death now.
The United States population more than tripled in the 20th century. It is projected to increase yet another 46% by the end of the year 2050. With fossil fuels running out, Rupert does not see how our infrastructure will keep pace.
You know, I think food exemplifies our problem as much as anything else. We have boxed ourselves into a situation where we transport food over enormous distances, where we fail to return nutrients to the topsoil so that it will grow anything else without those chemicals. And if those chemicals that come from oil and natural gas go away, the food goes away. And if the food goes away, people starve. And that process is beginning all over the world now. Our population is still growing, even as the resources needed to keep that population fed are going away. Our population should be diminishing also, but we're in a condition of overshoot. We're still expanding. There aren't enough resources on a finite planet, a closed sphere, to sustain infinite growth. We just can't do it.
Rupert believes the America of the future will bear little resemblance to the nation we know now.
The indicators that the United States of America is collapsing are all around us. The changes now are going to come much more rapidly. They're going to be much harder to take, and the choices that we make now are going to determine how we're able to deal with those challenges. It's a question about our ability to eat, to stay warm, to move, to interact, to live any kind of a life that bears any resemblance to anything like the life that we've lived before or that has any kind of quality in it. It means that the way of life that the world has come to know since the discovery of oil about 130, 140 years ago is all coming to an end. We're going to see things like governments, cities, and towns going bankrupt, which is happening. School districts are cutting back to 4-day weeks. Everywhere, major cities are doing police cutbacks and fire cutbacks. We're seeing major infrastructure failures. An explosion in San Bruno, California, of a natural gas pipeline that was laid in 1948, and nobody had the money to repair the infrastructure. We're going to see major failures and calamities and disasters like that. The bridge failure in Minnesota a few years ago, not to mention 30 million unemployed, collapsing home values all over the place, foreclosures soaring. We are seeing all the signs of collapse throughout this country, and they're becoming more obvious every day.
Rupert is certain these troubles aren't temporary, nor are they the ordinary products of an economic downturn. He is convinced they are symptoms of a coming collapse.
Collapse has happened to every empire in human history. That seems to be, if you will, a natural law, that empires can grow to a certain place and then they implode.
2,000 years ago, the Roman Empire was the most powerful on Earth. The similarities between Rome then and America today are striking. And the story of what ultimately befell that nation is told in museums around the world.
Like here in America today, Rome's armies were spread too thin in too many foreign countries. Barbarian invasions, like terrorist attacks and cross-border incursions as we see in Mexico's drug wars, were constant. The government was corrupt, and the only way to get anything accomplished was through bribery or by increasing taxes. This is no different than the stranglehold lobbyists, banks, and corporations have on our government today. America, like ancient Rome, has this blind faith that we are superior to the rest of the world and it's our destiny to reign supreme forever. It's not going to happen. We are going to learn some hard lessons and adjust to some hard circumstances, but we do have choices. The American empire is going to fall, but we do not all have to fall with it.
America dominates the world today on a scale far greater than even Rome could have imagined. But history as well as nature prove that size itself is no guarantee of continued survival.
And what's in front of us now is the same thing that was in front of the dinosaurs: evolve or perish, grow up or die. Change the way you think and the way you operate, because the universe will, without remorse, coldly it might seem, but with the beauty that is natural law, will let us go extinct.
The question of survival is very much like the Titanic. A huge ship that was believed to be unsinkable, that could go forever. On its maiden voyage, it sank, but there weren't enough lifeboats on that ship to save all the lives on board. At any point in that voyage, and especially after the iceberg hit, had there been an organized effort to scavenge from the Titanic enough material to make lifeboats, many, many hundreds of lives more might have been saved. Titanic, of course, is a great word. It implies and encompasses the size and the complexity of human industrial civilization. The Titanic is going to sink, and there are some people that will not believe it until they're underwater.
Michael Rupert isn't the only one with dark visions of the future. Others also anticipate the fall of America. Each believes the cause will be different, but the outcome hauntingly similar. They meet to share their insights to try to gain a broad perspective on the challenges we must confront, and to decide which threat is of most immediate concern.
The most important priorities that we have are saving lives. If I had to sum all the problems down to one word, it is overpopulation. Because there are 5 billion people on the planet today who did not exist at the dawn of the oil age. And they exist only because of oil and natural gas.
You know, it sounds like you're talking about the great die-off, like the Permian Triassic, you know, the mother of all mass.
There's a mass extinction underway right now.
Going through, they called it the great die-off.
I'll interject a few thoughts on that. I am not predicting any die-off. The near-term hurdle is we have to deal with our excessive errors we've made in our financial system. We've lived beyond our means, and we've extended that living beyond our means by issuing more credit, and there's going to be a reckoning there. The financial system as we know it is completely untenable, and there are going to be big changes. Once the majority of those changes happen, history shows time and again that people inherently help each other out. The more people prepare, the less likely that an exogenous financial shock is going to be
America today is the mightiest nation since the dawn of man. Yet history tells us empires rise only to inevitably fall. The circumstances change, but the results do not. Now, there are those who believe America's destiny will be no different. One of these men is Nathan Hagens, born 1965 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. With a PhD in natural resources, this former investment banker was managing a hedge fund when he came to the conclusion our current economic system was unsupportable. He resigned.
Our economic system is actually a giant global Ponzi scheme. And the way that translates is a lot of this debt and credit that has been built may someday never be paid off. How that unravels is going to have big consequences for the average American. Capitalism is going to have to be retooled, or it's going to completely go by the wayside. What we have now has been a failure. The future is going to look very different than the past in one primary regard, in that the world economy will no longer continue to grow. Until 12,000 years ago, humans lived on a hunter-gatherer, foraging lifestyle. And then we started to find and develop agricultural methods where we could grow things that we didn't need to eat that day. We could store them for many months or even a year. And then we started to live more sedentary lifestyles and develop technology, et cetera. And then in the 1700s, we basically hit the energy jackpot when we figured out how to use coal, and then subsequently in the 1800s, oil, and then in last century, natural gas. Now the question is, what's going to replace fossil fuels? Every American right now has 200 to 300 energy slaves standing behind them doing work that we take for granted. The energy in the taxi that got me here today, the lights in this building, Our food system, the average food travels 1,500 miles to get to our plate, and that all uses energy. All these things are subsidized by a one-time endowment of fossil energy that is so powerful that for all human intents and purposes, it is indistinguishable from magic.
Higgins believes the current global depression is the beginning of an economic collapse that will intensify as natural resources run out and alternative energies fail to replace them in time.
Technology is in a race with depletion, and depletion is winning. People need to recognize, okay, we live on a finite planet, and we have virtually infinite wants and perceived needs. But those two trends are butting up against each other, and what are we going to do about it? We've been so endowed with natural resources for 60, 70, 80 years, we have not really thought that this was a problem. There have been some recessions and even a Great Depression, but we've always reset from that. We build our institutions and our expectations assuming that this sort of subsidy will continue in the future. And now we've built a lifestyle that is no longer sustainable. We can live within our means, but only when we acknowledge that there are limits. And our economic system right now does not acknowledge that there are limits. The financial system as we know it is completely untenable, and there are going to be big changes.
The idea that our economic system is completely failing is hard to believe. But Higgins points to America's mountainous debt as proof. The balance between that debt and our available resources is delicate. When it tips, the system collapses.
We have built an entire industrial civilization on the assumption that there will be more every year. We now know that resources are harder to find, and in order to keep the system going, we've flooded the American economy as well as the world economy with more and more credit. We've created a large debt overhang, and right now we're kind of in this Wile E. Coyote moment where we've fallen off the cliff and the government is supporting the feeling that things are okay, but in reality, right around the corner, there's some very different trajectories. Basic needs, food procurement, water, just knowing that people are going to get fed is going to become more prominent in people's minds, just like it did in the Great Depression. The 1920s were this kind of go-go period where a lot of people were invested in the stock market. On Black Tuesday, the stock market lost 12%. And it lost 40% 2 months later, and eventually the stock market from its highs in 1929 to its lows in the mid-30s lost 90% of its value. In the Great Depression, around 35 million people lived in families where no one had a job out of a population of 120 million. So during that decade, the average income of those people that worked declined 40%. So it was pretty desperate back then. The government is attempting the same things that it attempted in the 30s by borrowing money and stimulating the economy. But the problem is we can't continue to inject money from thin air into a system and continue to think that it's going to hold together. You cannot solve a credit crisis by adding more credit, period.
The American economy rebounded from the Great Depression to become larger and more dynamic than ever before, reinforcing the theory of cyclical markets, in which booms are followed by busts, and then ultimately a bigger boom. Higgins cautions, this belief is more faith than fact.
I believe the United States is insolvent, and that some of these debts that we've incurred from the past are going to come home, and we're going to have to face the reality. The moment of bankruptcy comes when people want the money, when they want the claims to be paid off. America, unfortunately, is asleep with a lot of these issues, and part of this is due to cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is when Our brains don't want to acknowledge the gravity or seriousness of a situation. A good example is in Jared Diamond's book, Collapse, where he talked about a dam was about to break, and people 3 miles downstream were really afraid, and people 2 miles downstream were like really freaked out. But people living within a mile, living of the dam, they weren't concerned at all. If things are too frightening and too threatening, our brains tune it out because it would affect our behavior and it would be too painful to accept. So peak oil and peak credit and the depletion of cheap fossil fuels and what that means for the end of growth, it's too overwhelming. The financial reckoning that's coming could include many different scenarios. It could be no more U.S. currency and the U.S. currency is replaced by something else. It may happen that you have $100,000 in your bank and the next day you wake up and you have 10,000 Patriot dollars or something like that. It's happened many times. People remember Weimar Germany in the 1920s where there was the end of a system of claims, an end of a currency, and there was something that would replace it. The average American knows that something is wrong, but the problem is they don't really speak up and get really vocal about it because they don't know what to do.
Higgins feels this unprecedented financial crisis is the greatest threat to America today. The debate continues.
The problems are all interrelated. The economy, energy, food and water. Okay, and how that works. Because we live in a world clearly where if you have the money, you can buy them.
I put water at the top of the list, by the way, because everything everybody else has talked about, we have lived without once before. We've never lived without water, which is one of the reasons it's taken for granted. We've never lived without it, and we're running out of it and we don't see it. We live in a water economy. We do not live in a petroleum economy. Water runs the world. In 5 years at our current rate of behavior, we will have far more options for energy sources and far fewer options for water. But what's the big difference? There are replacements for oil. There are no replacements for water. People will look back on the early 21st century and say, what were
The story of every empire is in full. Yet while the United States has seen its share of hard times, the expectation has always been one of boundless growth. History, however, promises one day we will take a long step back. Some men believe that day is today.
Regardless of what our press releases are, it doesn't seem to me that we are making a better world to live in. My experience is the quality of life has been deteriorating rather than getting better.
That sounds like that assumes we're just, at base, a cynical, selfish species.
The human race has many redeeming qualities. The problem is which ones we choose to make paramount. The problem is which ones we choose to make our North Stars, if you will.
I would still argue that the most pressing, predictable problem is an ongoing economic crisis. We've come across this huge abundance of resources, and we're burning through those. And it's only until we see the bottom of that barrel will we start to change what we compete for and start to use technology as how do we get out of this mess. Sometime in the next decade, there's going to be a financial reckoning where we're going to have to dramatically tighten our belts, use less, consume less, because there will be less available. The United States right now uses twice the energy as the country of Ireland per individual. Yet on subjective well-being studies, they're just as happy as we are. We use 37 times the energy as the average person in the Philippines, yet they are just as happy as we are. So I'm sure that whatever comes, we will be able to adapt to it. It's just the 6-month window of when it happens that I worry about. One comment I'd like to make, though, is we're talking about what the most urgent problems are. Do we care about the next generation? Do we care about other species? Do we care about 300 years from now how many species or humans might inhabit the planet? Or do we just care about 2025? I mean, most people, frankly, care about this weekend.
Yeah.
Here's a subtle point. We evolved to not address a situation until it stared us in the face. There's something in economics called a discount rate, which is how much we value the present versus the future. A discount rate of 1 means we care only about this second. If you feed a goldfish, if you go out of town for 4 days and give it 4 days of food at once, it will eat until it explodes. Discount rate of 0 is like a robot, where you would live for 1,000,000 years and you care about today the exact same as you care about the year 2177. Humans have very steep discount rates, and what this means is that we as a species won't really address our problems until the problems are staring us in the face. You know, peak oil and climate change and all these grand super themes that we read about, these are like 10, 20, 30 years down the road. That has the mental weight of 0 to the average person hearing about it. If there's no toilet paper at the grocery store today and you heard that there's not going to be any anywhere in the country, that's like, oh my God, stock up on toilet paper. So people need an environmental cue showing them that scarcity or change is going to happen.
Higgins believes people don't recognize change until it's staring them in the face. Higgins also believes great changes could be upon us sooner than we realize.
Eventually, the currencies we have right now might go away and might be replaced by something. It's not even my imagination. Our own Treasury Secretary last year mentioned a global currency.
I am absolutely convinced that the imposition of a global currency will expedite the crash of everything much faster.
You know, it's helpful to remember that paper currencies are only about 150 years old. This has been a very short-term experiment.
Can I steer the conversation in a little bit more in a sort of a practical direction for a second? Everything I'm listening to is fascinating, and half of it I agree with, half of it I disagree with. What about our practical problems of the future? Which is that we and the world are running out of water.
John Cronin, born 1950, is the director of the Beacon Institute for Rivers and Estuaries and a senior fellow at Pace University. He has investigated environmental violations across the country and is developing a technology network to deliver real-time data on water quality. He sees a shortage of clean water as the most pressing threat to America.
We don't live in a petroleum economy, we live in a water economy. When we lose it, we lose American life as we know it right now. Water is the substance upon which we depend. It is the foundation of life, it's the foundation of the planet. But all over the nation, and all over the world, in fact, both quantity and quality of water is in dire danger in the 21st century. In the Western United States, the concept of water shortage, it's a headline in daily newspapers. In 2010, Governor Schwarzenegger told the state legislature in California that he would sign no more bills coming out of the state legislature until they revamped California's water laws. That's how severe it is. In the Midwest, you have the Ogallala Aquifer. There's this huge trapped underground sea of fresh water that was left behind by a glacier. You know, rainwater didn't create it. Rainwater doesn't replenish it. So as we exhaust it, which we're doing, we're taking away one of the single biggest supplies of fresh water in that region of the United States. In Baton Rouge, Louisiana, if you go into any restaurant that sells shellfish, there's a sign on the wall that warns you that eating that shellfish may be hazardous to your health. If you go to San Francisco Bay and you sit on a dock, there'll be a sign on a piling at the pier warning you that if you take a fish out of San Francisco Bay and eat it, it may be hazardous to your health. There's a standing rule for every river and stream in the state of New York that if you eat more than one meal of fish per week, it could be hazardous to your health. The damage has gone so far that the very food that we could rely on those waterways is really too hazardous for us to eat. The foundation of civilization, which is our rivers and waterways, is starting to crumble, and the society that's built on top of it is declining along with it. Pollution is on the rise. We are over-consuming water. We are not at the doorstep of a crisis. We are in a crisis. And if we don't take action immediately, the crisis will reach a point where we cannot recover from it.
Stories of the world's great empires all share one reoccurring theme: water. Wars have been fought over it, and losing it has meant the death of entire civilizations. Today, John Cronin believes water is in more demand and in shorter supply than ever before.
Water is as much a part of our history as wars and revolutions and art and music. But because we take it for granted, we don't see it as the foundation of society. If that foundation continues to crumble, the society on top of it is going to crumble along with it. This is not a new phenomenon. In fact, it's as old as civilization itself. In Mesopotamia, 6,000 years ago, where Iraq is today, the Sumerians invented irrigation using water from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And just as we are careless with our use of water now, the Sumerians were careless then. In an attempt to feed their increasing population, they over-irrigated. The farmers wanted to reduce irrigation, but their leaders refused, because food was a source of power. The consequence for the Sumerians was the death of their civilization. The stakes are just as high for us today. Imagine anything of consequence to the daily operation of the nation as a whole. If the White House ran out of water, everybody would have to leave the White House. If the offices of Congress ran out of water, everybody would have to leave Congress. The lights go out, you can sit at your desk. You run out of water, you pretty much have to leave. There's nothing for you to do. You can't use toilets, you have nothing to drink. When we talk about the idea of actually water stopping, you have to think about how it happens. One way is that we start running out of water, it all starts getting rationed. Now, rationing can mean a lot of things. It can mean that if you like to be clean every day, maybe you're not going to be clean every day. In Australia, you're not allowed to take a shower for more than 5 minutes. That's it. It's against the law. It can mean the water you used to take out of your tap now has to be boiled every time you use it, because we've had to resort to supplies of lesser quality. When you start reaching the point where your supply has declined so much that your everyday life gets rationed, that's a downward spiral, because our population's increasing. If you go now to other parts of the world, you go to Singapore. Singapore is the canary in the mine for the rest of the world. Singapore's entire future now is based on recycling its sewage waste into drinking water. And you know who else is thinking about this right now? Australia, California, Arizona are thinking about the dramatic cultural change it's going to require to get their citizens to accept the idea that we may have to start recycling sewage waste for drinking water.
In 2007, the U.S. Geological Survey projected that at least 36 states would face water shortages within 5 years. That means some of these states are already facing challenges. Cronin, however, is worried not just about the quantity of the water, but the quality.
19.5 million residents of the United States get sick from bacteria, viruses, and parasites every year. It comes from pollution of drinking water with human wastes. This is frightening in the 21st century because it's one of the oldest problems civilization deals with, keeping human waste separate from the water that we drink. Had a flu cause those kind of consequences, every medical expert and authority in the country would be put on alert because of it. And if we do not stop that pollution, we are facing rates of illnesses that are going to increase and the equivalent of a pandemic.
The waste dumped by sewage treatment plants into our oceans and rivers not only can contaminate drinking water with bacteria and viruses, but also with chemicals from the beverages we drink and the medicines we take.
One of the most alarming discoveries about pollution in the last decade is that there are things that we use every day that sewage treatment plants do not remove, that are starting to show up in the waters of the United States. So we're starting to find caffeine in fish. The coffee flows through us. It goes down our toilets. It goes to the sewage treatment plant, which is not equipped to remove caffeine. The caffeine flows out the sewage treatment plant into the nearby river. The caffeine goes into the fish. Maybe caffeine doesn't turn out to be a problem, but maybe other things do. Those plants were not designed to remove exotic chemicals, pharmaceuticals, prescription drugs that we take, or take a flu, or some sort of virus that starts transporting itself throughout water supplies of the United States, and we wake up one day with, literally with an epidemic.
Cronin makes a strong case for freshwater being the foundation of our society. He feels we need technological innovation allowing us to measure precisely what is in our water at any given moment.
So we start meeting needs, and I'll give you an example. I can go on any cell phone, and I can tell you the UV index and relative humidity in almost real time of any location on the planet. There's nobody who can tell you in real time what's in the glass of water you're drinking. We can save millions of lives had we a sensor technology to let us know as an early warning system what's in water. You know, how do you even create that world?
What you're saying is getting to the kernel of one of my pet peeves, that just because we can measure stuff, we can control everything. It's incredibly grandiose and foolish. What I'm seeing in our culture these days is what I call a disease of too much magic. And I think it's perhaps a very fortunate thing that the human race is facing what I would call maybe a reset of its activity, not necessarily a collapse, but let's call it a reset.
James Howard Kunstler, born 1948 in New York City, an investigative journalist and author. His specialty since the 1970s has been the oil industry. Kunstler has lived through an oil embargo enforced by foreign suppliers. Now, he is convinced the planet will soon impose a greater one that will likely lead to the collapse of society as we know it.
And when I was a young reporter, starting out in the early 70s, I covered the OPEC oil embargo of 1973, and it made a huge impression on me. You started to see lines form at the gas stations. People were unable to get to work. You know, I have this vivid memory of somehow I managed to get a full tank of gas, and I wanted to drive down to New York City to see a girl. And I drove down the New York State Thruway, and I was the only car on the thruway for about 150 miles. And it was like the day the earth stood still. It made a big impression on me to see how fragile the everyday world that we'd gotten accustomed to really was. That was 40 years ago. I think that the energy crunch of the 21st century is going to be much different, much harsher, have permanent repercussions that are going to thunder through the lives of generations to come. We are heading into uncharted territory of civilization. I think the people of the United States a generation from now are going to be astounded at how we squandered the wealth of the 20th century.